Hey everyone, it's Ellis, and this is going to be the Fiddlesticks Champion Rework First Impressions video, and so we're just going to get right into it. Fiddlesticks, I think that the rework teaser trailer thingy was my favorite, even topping that of Warwick's that Riot's released, so I'm actually really excited to see what is going on here. First thing up is his passive. This is a harmless Scarecrow. Fiddlesticks' trinket is replaced by Scarecrow Effigies that look exactly like Fiddlesticks. Effigies grant vision like regular wards. Enemy champions who approach an Effigy activate it, causing the Effigy to fake a random action, either basic attacking or casting Crowstorm, after which the Effigy destroys itself. So obviously I think that that's super valuable. It's a nice little passive, but the random question that I guess that I have for it is how applicable is it at higher MMR? We saw something like LeBlanc ended up getting a passive similar to this at one point. Nico's passive is mostly not really usable, for instance, and so these passives that really prey upon people not paying attention or knowing what's going on are definitely a bit interesting. However, I think that there's more value due to the nature of how Fiddlesticks tends to conduct himself as a champion and the things that even higher level players have to play around. So I think that unlike LeBlanc or Fiddlesticks to a certain extent, I think that there's a lot more trickery that you can maybe do with Fiddle. Fiddle can hold up to 2 effigies at once. Effigy cooldown decreases in duration, increase with Fiddlesticks' level at level 6. Placing an effigy reveals nearby wards for 6 seconds. That's pretty insane. So that's the second part of his passive, which I think that one's kind of nice. And I think that if that's true, then it's looking more like, right now, immediately in my mind, I have jungler and obviously support, but we'll see if maybe he has other potential roles. So now is the Q Terrify. Passive, while out of combat and unseen, if Fiddlesticks' abilities damage an enemy, they become terrified. So we'll just take a look at this one more time. Fleeing in the opposite direction, so it's really good to see that Fiddlesticks still has this fear available. Active, terrify the target and damage them based on their current health. That's a really important thing to remember, is that it's current, not max, and not missing. If this ability is cast on an enemy that was recently terrified, they take double damage instead of being terrified again. And so I think the marker is for that is this little red ring that you can see around Garen. I assume this means that he takes the double damage. I think the fact that his Terrify passive is that while out of combat and unseen, if Fiddlesticks' abilities damage an enemy, they become terrified, fleeing in the opposite direction. I think that's pretty nuts. I think that that's really, really strong, that all of his abilities can apparently do that. So his W, his E, his Crowstorm, that's an insane little passive to have on also what I'm imagining is a select target ability that can potentially deal double damage. And so the ratio for it matters a lot, and also, like, where is Riot going with this? So obviously now we take a look at the W. This is Bountiful Harvest. So what we're going to see here is Fiddlesticks drains the soul of all nearby enemies, damaging them continuously over a few seconds and healing Fiddlesticks based on the damage dealt. The last tick damages and heals based on the target's missing health. So missing health, again, another really important keyword. So his Q has current health, his W has missing. If Bountiful Harvest fully channels, or if no enemies remain to be harvested, Bountiful Harvest's cooldown is partially refunded. So I like the fact that they've really amplified his W, and I really like the fact that they're giving it more flexibility. I think the part where they add these extra damage modifiers are also really nice, but again, the ratios remain yet to be seen, so it's a little difficult to predict how viable is this really. The fact that it's AoE obviously puts into the ability to now play a solo lane, and as well as the jungle. So all of these things are still obviously on the menu. Top lane probably going to be a little less viable, I imagine, than perhaps mid lane, and we'll keep going into this. AD carry, probably not unless something is completely broken, but I'm really liking what I'm seeing so far. And again, those ratios are really important because it means that it gives Fiddlesticks ways to itemize differently than other champions if they don't have those ratios as a means to be reliable with utility items and the need to have damage items. So Reap, this is his E. Fiddlesticks damages and slows enemies in a crescent-shaped area in front of itself. Enemies in the center of the crescent are also silenced. So that's massive range, and the silence that interrupts channels and things of that nature. I think that's super fantastic. So it's really cool to see that Riot isn't removing silence slowly from the game. I think that silence is one of the most underappreciated abilities that a champion can ever possibly have. So the fact that it's also a skill shot in order to get the silence, given that its enemies in the center of the crescent are also silenced, I think that's really good. So I'm liking what I'm seeing on everything right now. The fact that his silence is still there. It's obviously not as obnoxious as his previous silence, which was just that you throw the crow or whatever it was that he was throwing and it bounces off everyone and silences. I think this one gives a lot more counterplay, and in turn, I'm hoping that it's also stronger. The fact that it has an alternate mode, which is just the slow, I think is fantastic as well, because this is really making it look like Fiddlesticks potentially has bruiser aspects, and if a bruiser has a silence, and it's sort of like an anti-mage that is also... I'm liking what I'm seeing. Everything is really good. Crowstorm. It looks like it's basically the same thing. Fiddlesticks channels before blinking to the target location and continuously dealing damage to nearby enemies for several seconds. But remember, you have to keep in mind all of his passives that he has on his abilities. These are obviously the skins that they are showing, and I'm most excited for this one. Obviously, the Halloween Fiddlesticks. But let's go back and talk about some of his abilities again. So the passive is interesting. His trinket, he doesn't actually have a trinket. So that's something that is a bit bizarre. Obviously, his effigies grant vision like regular wards, but does this mean that if he ends up going support, he can have even more wards, given that he has effigies as well as the support item? Because that would be pretty broken. But not having the trinket can definitely get a little bit weird if he were a support, because then he would just be a support that has more wards effectively, but he doesn't have the ability to have a sweeper lens until he gets to level 6, because then he places an effigy. But that's a little bit different than a sweeper lens, because it only reveals the wards that are in a nearby radius. So he basically ends up getting like a control ward, which I think that's fantastic gameplay design. So immediately in my mind, I'm thinking jungler, mid laner, support. When I'm seeing the passive, the fact that he can just place them down like this is really nice. Obviously, the effigies do dissipate and then they set up. So there's a lot of value with these effigies, especially because if they're inside of brushes, I imagine that they could actually do stuff sometimes because of vision control and the nature of how Fiddlesticks is always looking for those Crowstorms in mid to late game. It does allow him some trickery that I think is very different than, say, a Nico or, say, LeBlanc's very old passive that they tried to end up doing before ended up reverting it. So I think his passive's fantastic. I think the Crowstorm and everything looks really nice. I love the animations on everything. This really does look like a horror-themed champion, and we're releasing it in the middle of March. So I'm just throwing that out there. But the Terrify looks fantastic too. So it's a pretty boring ability, I guess, if they haven't... I mean, it looks like a kind of boring ability, but if he's a bruiser, then I think that the Terrify is just really strong. I think that'll actually be a pretty core part of his kit. And then the fact that he can open up with the fear like old times is completely fine as well. So it's just a really big steroid in terms of damage. Now right here, we don't see Garen's health bar. We don't really know what this is doing. We also don't even know what levels these champions are right now. So it's hard to really to think about. If this number has an insane base stat, and if his current and missing health ratios on his W and his E are strong, then Fiddle's going to be a really, really strong champion. The nature of his kit, how much control is inside of it, the fact that he has a silence, the fact that he has fear on all of his abilities now, the fact that he has these wards that are just built into his kit, the fact that his kit comes with control wards also in a way allows him to save on economy. And if these numbers are just really good, then Bruiser Fiddlesticks inside of either mid lane, jungle, or support is just looking like it's going to be so powerful. Bountiful Harvest, obviously going on to all enemies. This is the bread and butter of what can potentially make him a mid laner in addition to a jungler. I think that this is fantastic as well. The last tick, damage based on target's missing health, also really good. I mean, it's all looking really nice. And, you know, the really cool thing about it is that Fiddle is not looking like a burst champion, you know? So I think it's time for Fiddle to put on a mask. But I think this is fantastic. Hopefully his sustain is really good. The crescent sweep is really cool. I imagine that it's a spammable ability. Now, the scary thing is that if his E is a spammable ability, like his old E, a spammable slow or silence is just so much control when paired with his Crowstorm and when paired with the fact that he can just enter brushes, exit brushes, and apparently just keep getting his fear back. So he has to be out of combat, not just enter brush and then go right back in, sort of like the old Duskblade that used to be really strong when you would do that in its initial state. But there's so much power and control inside of this kit that it's just so fantastic to look at. Crowstorm, I mean, it's the same thing that it used to be before. I love the animation on it. It doesn't look like there's anything else that's too chaotic about it. Other things that we have to keep in mind, because I don't believe that the data for it is out yet, I could be wrong at the time of making this video, is, for instance, what is Fiddle's base movement speed? What are his base stats? What are his base damage numbers on all of his ability? What, how does he scale with like cooldown reduction? Obviously, I would imagine that Zanya's Hourglass is still going to be integral to his kit. What are his AP ratios? Because Q is really scary. The fact that it can deal double damage to a unit that was recently terrified. That provides for some really strong nuke potential with RQ that just allows Fiddle to keep basically moving forward. And again, if he's a bruiser with built-in sustain and percent ratios on his W combined with the silence, things just start to get really scary. Now, the other thing about his effigies is if he can actually stack them, not that I think it's going to matter all that much. He could, in theory, place them on top of himself or allies inside of team fights, and I guess that could potentially mess up some people's auto attacks. The other thing about it is, can they block skill shots? That is what I'm really curious about, because it does look like they can be damaged by abilities. So if they can block skill shots, this is also pretty big. But then what is the recharge timer on them? And we know that he can hold up to 2 at once, but if he also has like this mini pseudo shield by just placing effigies down to block really key skill shots, that's really, really big. I think that's massive, especially because it can obviously act for his allies, given that the range on them doesn't seem super terrible, depending on if he's hugging an ally or something. Maybe the range is even bigger than portrayed in this video. I love the champion. I think it looks fantastic. I think that there is a lot of room for creativity here, and I'm getting like Shaco-esque vibes, but I think that Riot is really hitting the mark on this Fiddle rework. The only way I think that this can really just go belly up is if his numbers are not there, and if the numbers aren't there, then he's just going to fall apart, because his kit has too much of a reliance on probably tethering a line. And what I mean by that is like champions like Kossadin, where the champion clearly has a really, really strong kit, but if it's just not there in terms of being like a stat check or something of that nature, then it's going to be very, very lackluster. I imagine that he'll be really strong out the gate. I can't tell, obviously, for sure if he'll be jungle, mid, or support. I just guess, given the roam potency, as well as old Fiddlesticks even had sometimes the ability to debut in mid lane, even at high ends in solo queue. Some people did try to make it work. There were a couple of one-trick ponies that also tried to play in mid lane. I imagine that we could see something like that, but again, it's going to be based on his sustain numbers and where he can go from that. So I like it. This is very nice. Okay, this is really making me optimistic for the Volibear rework as well, because Riot has just released some really good champions lately. Everyone can cry and complain about Aphelios, but Aphelios is obviously really good. Set was a very popular champion. Everyone likes Set. Senna, absolutely fantastic. Like, everything just seemingly keeps getting really good, and the creativity on this champion is so good. This is like playing Blue and Magic. So that's quite literally what the champion is. It is so beautiful.